human responsibility is an aspect of creation. It is not this transcendent rule that stands alongside God that sets out the rules of which, in the ways in which he is allowed to conduct creation. Okay? Human responsibility is one of the ways that God has chosen to make creation. He's chosen that people will exist, that they'll be given commands, that they'll obey or disobey those commands, and be held responsible. Okay? And whether or not God is in control of all of that is completely irrelevant to what human responsibility is as a concept. It's nothing more than you being responsible to the commands of God. Okay? So there's actually no contradiction here. Right? Calvinists would say that the Bible teaches God controls all things, determined all things, purposed all things, planned all things, and that he holds people responsible. It teaches both. The only reason this seems contradictory to people is because they have come along and falsely assumed this ridiculous false assumption that responsibility to God presupposes freedom from God. Right? This false assumption they bring to the picture. It's only when you introduce this false claim that the two truths, God controls all things and holds people responsible, appear to contradict. But if you take that false assumption out of the picture, you just have two statements of fact. God determines all things and holds people responsible. God holding people responsible is part of what he's determined, right? It's part of the story, part of the picture. So one of the things I always like to do is show that this false assumption is completely obliterated by my three favorite verses. Hebrews 1:3, Acts 17, and Colossians 1. So these three verses talk about God's metaphysical relationship to the things he's created. God didn't just create everything and let go of it metaphysically. God created everything, and everything by definition of being finite, by definition of being created, by definition of being less than God, relies upon God's power for continued existence at all times. Hebrews 1:3 says that God upholds the universe, which would include you. God upholds everything he's created by his power. Colossians 1 says the exact same thing, different phrase. It says, in God all things consist, or have their being. And Acts 17 brings it down onto our level, the personal level, and says that we live and move and have our being in God. And the verse is always true. There's not one moment of time, even when you're sinning, you are living and moving and having your being in God. Even when you're sinning, God is upholding your existence by his power. Apparently, God does not need to metaphysically disconnect himself from sin, quote unquote. Because sin is, again, it's the breaking of laws, it's a description of the actions of human beings. There's nothing sinful about the material that you're made out of. There's nothing inherently evil about the material and the matter and the energy that God continuously upholds and controls. So God can be the cause of all things, including sinful actions, and not be a sinner, because it's not about touching or controlling evil things. Evil is a description of disobedience to the laws of God. So causation on God's part is dealing with simple metaphysics, which, as these three verses lay out, is unavoidable. God is the sustaining power behind all things, including sinful actions, and yet God's not a sinner because sin deals with laws. So the only way God could be sinning is if there's a law that said, God, thou shalt not. The obvious fact is there's no laws for God. Nobody created God, nobody presides over God, nobody gave God any laws. Bringing it back now to the idea of responsibility. If the three verses I just read are always true, then you are never free from God, not even for one moment of your existence.